In the few years since the COVID-19 pandemic, conversations about Africa have focused on debt restructuring, suspension, and even forgiveness. So it may surprise people to hear that the continent currently holds investable wealth worth $2.4 trillion. The recently published Africa Wealth Report 2023 from Henley and Partners paints a picture of possibilities and opportunities, even in the midst of trying times for the continent. The report indicates that Africa's wealth market is growing steadily, offering opportunities for investors, entrepreneurs, and businesses looking to expand their operations in the region. But while there are opportunities, there are causes for concern. While Africa's millionaire population is expected to rise by 42% over the next 10 years, Henley and Partners found that the total high net worth individuals numbers in Africa have fallen by 12% in the past decade. So what else does the Africa Wealth Report hold? Joining me now is Troy Henley, Managing Director, Henley and Partners, UK, Nigeria. Henley and Partners is the global leader in residence and citizenship by investment. Troy, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So let's start with this $2.4 trillion. I know that's been a very big part of the conversation since the report came out. South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco account for more than half of Africa's high net worth individuals. So please, where is this investable wealth? Why do we feel like we're not seeing it?
Yes, sure. That may come as a surprise to some people hearing that number. But investable wealth can be defined as an asset that is considered fairly liquid and can be used to invest in other assets relatively quickly. So some examples are cash, stocks, and bonds. In the context of Africa, this is, of course, across the continent of Africa, but there's a heavy concentration in those countries you mentioned, South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. And of course, it's heavily concentrated amongst high net worth families as well. Yeah.
So when we look at the projections that you've also found, growth over the next decade with the population of millionaires on the continent expected to increase by 42%. I want us to go back a little bit because that's the future. Let's go back to what we saw the last 10 years bring us. And the report found that currently with 52 African-born billionaires worldwide, only 23 of them live on the African continent. And it raises a very critical question. Are we seeing African billionaires leave? And why are they leaving? How does their departure even impact the continent's economy as well?
Yes. So I think there's two parts to this. As you point out, the first is that the growth of high net worth individuals, that includes millionaires, billionaires. The long-term trend of this is upward, and this is a very positive thing. However, you correctly point out in recent years, there's been a slight drop in these numbers. This can be blamed on a few local factors, such as socioeconomic difficulties. However, we must all keep in mind there's been some significant global pressures that we've seen in the past few years, such as COVID-19 affecting a lot of global trade, inflation, and now there's a real cost of living crisis. And so this has hit wealth right across the board, including the wealthy. And then the second part is, yes, so those statistics you mentioned about billionaires and maybe fleeing Africa or capital flight from Africa sounds quite concerning, but it isn't the whole story of wealth in Africa. So what we know about high net worth people is that they're globally mobile. So while they are moving across the world, they're obtaining investments across the world, residences, second citizenships, usually as an insurance to increase their global mobility. But these people actually leaving their country permanently and never returning, this is actually very rare. And we know this at Henley and Partners because even though we are experts in residence and citizenship, it's very rare that we're helping people move out of Africa. That's not a common occurrence.
That's interesting. So when we look at this fall in African billionaires, as you talked about, there's markets, but there are also those who are dominant in the markets. And the performance of African billionaires are linked to, unfortunately, the poor performance in major markets like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt as well. In terms of the projections for the next decade for these top three countries, what are they? Will they hold on to their top spots? Are there challenges as well with possibly new countries coming up and becoming much more viable and investable because they've learned from the mistakes of countries like Nigeria and South Africa as well, even though they also have individual challenges they're facing?
Yes, so these three will probably retain their top spots. They will still have some growth. It just won't be as phenomenal as what we've seen in previous decades, where South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt have just had booms of wealth and a number of high net worth people. And so you're right. We actually forecast on a percentage basis to have significant growth in some rising stars. Countries such as Angola, Cote d'Ivoire, Namibia, on a percentage basis, these countries and a few others, they're going to have very impressive growth. And this is due to certain sectors within these countries having impressive development. So those are the ones to watch.
The ones to watch. All right. So as we expect the African billionaire population to grow, it also shows us that the data means Africa's wealth management market is also going to grow. The estimated value, 60% in the next decade. So Troy, what are the trends you see driving this growth? Because, of course, you spoke a little bit earlier about what could possibly drive millionaires out of the continent and what they could be looking for in terms of the economic situation. But with this wealth management market growing 60% in the next decade, what's going to drive this growth?
Yes. So as I mentioned, the high net worth people, they are globally mobile, but a significant amount of their wealth will still remain in the continent, and ideally this will grow. As Africa improves their perception of being more stable, more safe, better governed, there'll be even less incentive to take wealth out of the continent, which is a very positive thing for everyone involved. So in order to manage this wealth, preserve this wealth, the local professional firms will likely have to expand their service for this market. And one interesting thing you might see is a growth in family offices. So family offices, these are becoming a real economic force in the West in themselves and not yet prevalent in Africa. We may see an uptick in this in years to come. Yeah.
So, Troy, it's really fantastic to see that the number of wealthy Africans will increase in the coming years. But it's also difficult for us to forget the fact that the World Bank says that seven of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are located on the African continent, mainly in southern Africa. And while the report points out that private wealth on the continent is constantly evolving, the issue of unequal distribution of wealth from one continent to the other and one country to the other is also seen. And we've seen how when it comes to this wealth situation, South Africa dominates in certain numbers, Egypt dominates in certain numbers as well. But when it comes to this unequal wealth distribution, what is the report finding when it comes to this?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly a major issue in Africa. You can find some of the largest levels of inequality in the whole world in the African continent. The silver lining to this is that our report is relatively positive on the outlook, with the possibility of decreasing that inequality in future. A lot of wealth is likely to be attracted to the continent, grow in the continent, and include investing into the local economies instead of just outwards. This means more local businesses, local employment, hopefully a reduction in this gap between the rich and the poor. And we've seen this play out in other developing economies in the past, such as China and now India. We are seeing this. So bright future ahead for Africa, we hope. Another interesting thing we mentioned in the report, which is worth keeping in mind, is impact investing, which is, of course, a very promising phenomenon whereby investments are done with the goal of creating social change. And so this is growing in interest locally in Africa and with investors from the African diaspora. So something to keep an eye on.
Something else I find quite interesting, which is more to your area of specialization, is that this investment migration sector is really it's seeing a boom, particularly on the African continent now. It's been on a growth trajectory for the past 25 years, but it seems to be a relatively new phenomenon on the African continent. What's driving the sector here for us? What's driving Africans to look into investment migration? And what countries are even leading the way when it comes to the investment migration sector?
Yes, investment migration, I mean, it's been on a growth trajectory for several decades. But recently, given global volatility, nationals of just about any country around the world are now seeing the value of a second residence, a second citizenship. We actually get inquiries from over 200 nationalities globally. And that actually includes UK nationals, US nationals. And these are people you wouldn't typically think are seeking a second passport. but there are pressures locally on those sorts of people to think about diversifying. So in the case of Africa, to your question, I mean, the reasons that someone would gain a second residence and citizenship is quite similar to Western nationals, but the difficulties are a little greater, actually. African passport holders, they face greater difficulties with global mobility when they're trying to travel visa-free. So if you take the example of a Nigerian passport holder, he or she can travel to 46 countries visa-free, whereas nationals of the United Kingdom can travel to 189 countries visa-free. So that divide is huge. That disadvantage to, for example, Nigerian business people, that's massive. So just like nationals of Western countries, though, African investors they still have often a sense of discomfort holding a passport of just one country. This is something we're seeing globally at the moment. And to your question about the leading nationalities for investment migration services, so interestingly, it's the countries you mentioned at the start that have the highest numbers of high net worth individuals: Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa. They were actually some of our leading nationalities for inquiries at Henley and Partners globally. So it seems that wherever there are high net worth people, we get inquiries, but particularly in Africa, this is the case.
That's really interesting. So because at the end of the day, this sort of investment migration is all about investors. It's about investments at the end of the day. It's a sort of a business transaction they're looking to do. But we're also seeing that the global economic downturn is going to impact them as well. We're in the second year of a sharp slowing growth. Investors are a lot more risk adverse, even if they're just investing in migration as it may be. And the World Bank is predicting global economic outlook for this year will slow to 1.7% from 3%. How do you think this sort of economic situation we're facing globally will affect the investment migration sector?
Yes, I think it's true that there would be some investors that are more risk averse, more conservative with their investments. They may delay acquiring a second residence or citizenship because ultimately this is through investment that we're helping people. So the other thing is perhaps currency devaluations, currency crises, which we're seeing play out in African countries, may hinder the buying power of African nationals. However, in practice, it's very interesting to note that, across our decades in business at Henley and Partners, we've noticed that when there are periods of volatility, the number of inquiries actually go up. These are the times when high net worth individuals are most uneasy. They're most likely to be searching for an insurance, a way to protect themselves and their families.
All right, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I want us to touch on it before we wrap up the conversation. Economic mobility, you've touched on the passport situation. So when it comes to visa-free access to global economic outputs, Africans and those from other developing nations with sizable and growing private wealth are often at a distinct disadvantage. And more than just a travel document, our passports can define our financial freedoms regarding access to international investments and business opportunities. So in terms of the current situation with economic mobility on the continent, what did the report find? What does the future look like? What sort of trends do you think will also drive that mobility across Africa?
Yes, this is one piece of research I found the most interesting out of the Africa Wealth Report 2023. So it is that investors with poor visa-free global access, they're effectively shut out of a quite shockingly wide breadth of opportunities for economic mobility and growth. So, for example, business people, I'll use the Nigerian passport as an example again. Business people traveling on this passport, they can access only 1.5% of the global economy visa-free. Compared with someone who holds a St. Kitts and Nevis passport, they can access 37% of the global economy visa-free. So it's a new dynamic in this passport discrepancy that we're highlighting. And the implications are huge. The importance of being able to access global markets, to build your business, to have access to strong investments and strong currencies cannot be understated. The other element of it is that when you are this global investor, this global business person, and you're making these international connections and relationships, it actually benefits your home country. So not only can this discrepancy affect that individual and their business, but it can have an effect on the home country's GDP in Africa. So something that hopefully can be reversed.
All right. And so the wealth report, as you said, does paint a more positive picture. And with more millionaires, billionaires coming, a larger African wealth management market as well, it does seem like the future could be bright. Troy Henley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And the Africa Wealth Report 2023 is courtesy of Henley and Partners, and it shows a number of interesting highlights for what wealth and investment could look like in the coming decades right here on the African continent. And while we have conversations about debt distress, write-offs, forgiveness, cost of governance, there's also something happening on the flip side. There's the positivity with a growing number of Africans doing big and being big right here on the continent, and how that can help the continent also deal with issues around unequal distribution of wealth. So my last guest was Troy Henley, the Managing Director of Henley and Partners for UK and Nigeria. And that's how we wrap things up on Business Edge for today. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can also visit our website, www.newscentral.africa, for all the latest news and information from here on the continent. At 12 p.m. West African time, you have News Central Now coming your way. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Have a restful weekend, because Monday, we try to make it profitable. Have a good one.